It's the Underpowered Hour. On this week's show, the Discovery Sport gets a tiny facelift and some trim chaos. The classic Defender gets an EcoBoost engine swap, and then Steve and Ike dive into the rich history of Land Rover Campers. And now, without delay, here's the show.
Welcome to the Underpowered Hour. I'm Steve Beres, mild-mannered television executive by day and Land Rover collector by night. You can find out more about our cars and what we're working on at theberescollection.com or follow us on Instagram at theberescollection. I'm joined, as always, by my good friend, Ike Goss.
Thank you to everyone joining us today. I'm the underseat toolbox to Steven's refrigerated console. I'm the rattly lug wrench of podcasting, Ike Goss. I own and operate Pangolin 4x4 in Springfield, Oregon, where we live and breathe Land Rovers. Check us out online on Facebook, Instagram at Pangolin 4x4. Let's get started.
All right, Ike. Well, in the news this week, a couple of exciting, huge news out of Land Rover. They are releasing is this a special edition? Is this just the new update? What is this exactly to the much beloved, and I'm sure heavily purchased Discovery Sport? Remember that car?
I'm gonna call this something that is maybe the most popular phrase to describe a Land Rover. I'm gonna say it's a stopgap.
Oh yes, that is a great way to describe it.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, so I think there's a gap between the existing Discovery Sport and the new Defender Sport, and This vehicle has been warmed up and warmed over and presented as the new generation of Discovery Sport. I wouldn't say generation is the right term.
No.
The new model.
It's a little facelift.
Little facelift.
Yeah,
sure.
Little tiny facelift.
Because got a little update.
As we've heard, there's going to be working on it as apparently a smaller version of the Defender. Do you think they're going to call it the 80-inch? You think we could?
I have zero confidence that will happen.
That'd be too bad. But yeah, a sport version, and really the Discovery Sport is sort of, it's the, at least the spiritual predecessor to the Freelander, right?
You think Discovery Sport,
so.
Freelander?
I think so.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah.
Don't you think that the Freelander's evolution naturally brought it to Discovery Sport?
Maybe.
And just the name Freelander, you got to wash that off. Discovery was slightly less worrisome.
Sport is such a interesting term when it comes to describing vehicles because it's usually the smaller, less expensive model.
That's right.
And so I just picture like an uncle being like, "Hey there, Sport."
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, Slugger.
Hey, Slugger.
Yeah.
What are you doing there, Chief?
What's up, little squirt?
Which is interesting because on the Range Rover side, the Sport is literally the high performance version of the Range Rover, because the Range Rover weighs as much as a condominium complex now, and the Sport Range Rover, can be outfitted in a pretty significant sport spec. I mean, with the same suspension as the Octa and all that sort of stuff.
And that used to be Grand Sport, right? If you had a sedan or a touring car or something like that, you would make it the Grand Sport GS model, right?
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So this is now a slightly updated version of the slightly underappreciated and maybe underdeveloped Discovery Sport, which will be around for as long as it needs to be before the Defender 80-inch is released. So I'd like to see it. I'd like to see a new Defender. I mean, obviously it will share absolutely zero commonality with a real 80-inch, but I don't know. I would just like Land Rover to, acknowledge that, there's a...
It's not going to happen.
No, I know. It's not going to happen. But, I mean, the 80-inch would be 170 inches long anyways, just like the rest of them. They're all way bigger than that.
They're just a little bloated. They're just, they're 6'3", 215 pounds.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a svelte 270 pounds. But it's interesting. What are some of the features of this facelift? You still get your normal kind of good, better, best kind of trim levels and things? Or what do they got cooked up for this one?
Well, I think the SE and HSE trim levels have been usurped. They've replaced that.
Okay.
I mean, I assume they still exist, but they've been renamed the Landmark and Metropolitan editions, which...
That doesn't make any sense at all. Which one's better?
I don't know.
It's impossible to tell.
I don't know. Which one would you say is better?
The Landmark one, maybe? Maybe Metropolitan? I don't know.
I don't know either.
I don't know. I don't know.
I don't know.
Nobody knows.
At least with HSE, there's one more letter. Right?
There's one more letter. That's got to be better. That letter's an H. That's usually that's a good one. Yeah.
But Landmark versus Metropolitan, I'm not really. That doesn't really. Yeah. I don't really know.
That's a lot. It's a lot to take in. With this renaming and rebadging and reing, everything is just a little reread these days.
Well, at least this is a designation that they use across the range. So as soon as consumers are up to speed. Wait, you're saying they don't use that across the range?
No, that's not. Wait, this just did. No, this is, it just sounds like a one-off just for this stupid facelift. So, well, there you go. Yet another one hit out of the park by the naming group there at the Land Rover. Is this one optionally fitted with any totems? Can you get totems?
I was just thinking that if it had totems, but I think there's a lot of nomenclature that they use that is, as a consumer, really confusing.
Sure. Yes. It's a pretentious design language that no one else in the world uses.
Maybe it's like an epic fantasy movie where you just have to really, there's a lot that you gotta learn.
You just have to kind of learn, immerse yourself in the world. Really, you have to learn the lore and just kind of steep yourself in it.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of steeping yourself into it, if you want an engine-swapped Land Rover Defender, but you don't like an LS series motor, well, there is a company out there that is taking care of that for you by adding a Ford EcoBoost 2.3-liter engine to classic Land Rover Defenders. So you can have the Ford's sort of somewhat reliable EcoBoost engine.
Reliable.
In the Land Rover Defender.
What I think is interesting about this is sort of something that's happening throughout the automotive industry, right? You've got this tendency to start making smaller engines that make more power. I feel like for a long time, the tendency was to just bigger.
Yeah.
And now it's still like more power, but out of smaller displacement. So compound turbochargers and other things that, really improve the power to weight ratio. So I think that's kind of cool. They're putting smaller engines and stuff. And so then correspondingly, there's a lot more aftermarket support for smaller engines. Than there used to be in terms of powering bigger vehicles. You didn't really see a lot of 4-cylinder engine conversions for your, whatever. It was always a V6 or a V8 or a inline 6-cylinder turbo diesel or something like that. So from that standpoint, that's kind of cool. And there is definitely a lot of engineering and aftermarket support for the EcoBoost engine, but has kind of a little bit of a mixed reputation.
I agree. It does have a little bit of a mixed reputation.
Have you heard about some of the various problems that these motors have?
No. What are some of the... I know that there are problems across the line of EcoBoost, but what are some of the specific problems?
I think it's kind of the problem with producing a lot of power out of a small engine is that, cylinder pressures are increased and, there's a lot that motor has to support. And so these motors are making 300 horsepower or something like that.
Yeah, 300 in this spec, 310 horsepower.
Out of 2.3 liters. So that's a pretty small engine. That's exactly the same size as the 2 1/4 engine.
That's exactly
It's called 2 1/4, but it's actually 2.286. So it's really close to the original displacement, which made 77 horsepower.
Something like that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So close to 4 times the amount of horsepower in the same amount of space.
From what I've heard, and I haven't used one of these engines, but from what I've heard, they can have cooling leaks, internal cooling leaks, which cause them to overheat and turbocharger failures. So kind of I won't say, I guess par for the course for high horsepower, small displacement engines. It seems like of that era, seems like they're always getting better, improving. And, it's interesting that this is becoming a pretty highly hyped platform. I think Rovers North is selling their own engine conversion, and a lot of companies like Defender conversion companies are starting to incorporate that into their builds. Yeah. So...
Well, and apparently this Wolf Classics, which is the article here, we'll put in the show notes, that been talking about this, they, apparently, and I don't know what this means exactly, but worked with Ford, which I think means ordered an engine from Ford. Okay. That is specifically tuned for this platform. It mates with a 10-speed automatic transmission into the Defender's existing transfer case. So really all you're doing is replacing the transmission end to engine, but the running gear from transfer case back is all original Land Rover. So the question is, does that, and this would be a Puma, I guess these are Pumas that they're doing this to. What is the transfer case in that car? And can it take 350 pounds of torque at 310 horsepower? Like, is it even remotely rated for that kind of power going through it?
I don't know the answer to that. I think that there are upgrades that you can do, cross-drilling the, gears in the Defender, the LT230 to increase the lubrication capacity of those. And, there are updates that you can do so that they hold up to reasonable power. But I don't know what they're rated for. Yeah. But I just looked up which EcoBoost is kind of a sort of a catch-all term almost for a lot of different small displacement Ford engines, all the way from 1 liter to 3 liters, I think. And so I started typing in, EcoBoost, and one of the prompts, the AI prompts, was which EcoBoost engines to avoid. And they said that the answer was 1 liter engines with wet liners or the 2.3 liter. And this engine conversion seems to be based around
the 2.3 liter.
The 2.3 liter. So I am not sure.
They didn't do that Google first. That was the problem. They should have Googled.
It also may be that, they've fixed some of these problems, but you can still buy, I believe, the Ford 2.3 liter EcoBoost engines from Ford Performance.
Of course you can. Yeah. They don't. Ford doesn't care what you put it in to blow up. They don't. They don't mind. And I will say though, from a package standpoint, just from the physical footprint of that motor, it does look to fit into the engine bay of the Defender a little bit better than an LS engine. It doesn't look quite as smashed in there. It looks a little bit more like the TDCI motor, right? Yeah, and it looks a little bit more like the TDCI motor sitting in there as opposed to some of these other conversions that, those engines are just sort of big and they're also heavy, right? Admittedly, if you're taking out, a 300 TDI motor or something like that, that is a very, very heavy motor, but still, it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see what the long-term performance of these converted cars are, and if the EcoBoost takes over from the LS swap,
What's impressive about these motors is they're cheap. You can buy a brand new one of these motors, I think, for about $6,000, $5,700, or depending on how you have it spec'd. But, that's less than the cost of rebuilding your old V8, and that's probably a huge for a company that's cranking out Defender conversions. They can just slap these things in at a pretty low price. This place has them for $4,600. So
wow, that's incredibly cheap.
The conversion parts to support the engine would probably cost quite a bit more, but that's super cheap. You can't rebuild an old motor for that.
Would you, if you had to do this, someone was threatening your life, if you didn't swap an engine into this Defender, would you do that 2.3 liter, or would you look at the 2.8 Cummins turbo diesel, which has the same torque, only 161 horsepower, but the same torque, and a package that is arguably a little more suited to the Defender, as it's about the same size. It's a little bit heavier, but it's about the same size as the TDCI motor that's used in the last iteration of the classic Defender.
I don't know the answer to that. I have seen several of those 2.8 liter conversions. It's a much more expensive engine. It's like 10 grand or something like that, maybe.
Yeah.
There are conversion parts to support it. There's some, a little bit of interference with the steering, there at the front. I think you've got to do some massaging around the steering box and a few other things. Maybe relocate some things on the engine to be out of the way of that. But same sorts of potential issues, there's not an amazing proven track record of reliability for either of these motors. And, you have to get rid of a lot of things. The conversions that you see, it's usually like aluminum radiators with no fan shrouds and electric fans and, there's usually an ECU, and it just depends on what your goals are for an engine conversion. But I think for myself, I want something like if I'm going to do all this work and engineering to put this motor in this car, like I want it to last a pretty long time, more like longer maybe than a standard, like just rebuilding the engine and putting it back in. Ideally, it would last for longer because, it's a lot more work to do all that conversion stuff. And then, I'm kind of thinking about what am I going to do when this engine wears out? Is there going to be a replacement available for it? Is it, is it going to have parts support? Can I fix it if I like it and want to keep it? And the answer to a lot of those questions for some of these motors is kind of unclear.
It's interesting. These Wolf Classics guys are saying that because of their partnership, again, heavy air quotes around that, with Ford Performance, that you can take this Defender to any Ford dealer. Oof. I think I would put heavy air quotes around that.
We should test that theory. We should call the local Ford dealer and ask them. But, I think some of these Ford Performance and GM Performance engine, like crate engines, I think they will do some service work on those, because they sell them as, a platform to rebuild your Classic or whatever.
Turnkey platform, yeah.
But as far as where that stops,
Yeah, will they repack your...
They're not going to work on your transfer case if you put an engine conversion in.
Yeah, exactly. Will they rebuild a differential for you?
No.
They don't have any of the tools to do that even. So
they might diagnose your fuel injection problem. They may do that. I don't know. Yeah, that'd be interesting to know. But again, what's the long-term, situation with these engines? We don't know.
Yeah.
I'm kind of excited about the BMW M57 engines. Those are pretty cool. 3-liter turbo diesel inline 6 cylinders. Those make a lot of power, and they seem to be very reliable, and there's a ton of aftermarket for those.
Yeah, that's right. We'll have to talk to Ralph. We'll have to get him back on and talk specifically about BMW engine swapping your
I kind of want to do one.
I do too, actually. If I were to do any one of them, because generally speaking, and I've driven the best, LS swapped ones. They're cool. That's fine. It's not ever anything I want or have wanted even. Yep. I have, obviously we have a John Eels built engine in the Defender. We have, so certainly, some high performance Defender stuff, but the BMW one definitely intrigues me. That I would be interested in that because it was, BMW owned Land Rover for a little while. There were, of course, the famous South African BMW, derived Defenders. And I kind of feel like it's one of those things where, it's kind of in canon a little bit, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's there's a Land Rover part number for that engine.
Yeah, exactly, which is really interesting. So, all right, well, speaking of a Land Rover part number for an interesting set of features, today we're going to talk a little bit about Land Rover Campers. So much interest last week when we briefly touched on your irresponsible purchase of a Westfalia, that the excitement, if you will, around Land Rover Campers has been reignited. In fact, I was in Tennessee, last weekend, the weekend before, I don't remember, and found a pretty nice looking Dormobile that had all of its bits and everything. And it's interesting, but there's a long history of Land. Is there somebody that's about to break into your? It looks like you're about to be attacked.
Unclear.
Yeah.
There's definitely a person outside the window of the studio looking in and being strange.
Is it Linus?
I can't tell.
Okay, all right. Well,
I can't tell. They just heard Land Rover Campers and they were like, "What?"
They're like, what? You see, that's how interesting it is. But of course, the most famous Land Rover camper, and one that both you and Linus own, is the Dormobile, which I think is probably the most famous, the most well-known, the most recognizable, so much so that if you look at, I always grade the quality of, or notoriety, I'm sorry, of a classic Land Rover by, is it one of the pictures in the front of the Rovers North catalog? One of those pencil drawings of all the different, did it make that list of, that's a pretty thorough list. I think if you had every Land Rover on that list, you'd have a pretty complete collection. But it, of course, is in there, and I think for a lot of people who had their first classic Land Rover and cracked open a Rovers North catalog said, what the hell is that thing with the accordion roof?
Yeah. No, you're right. And, I think when I first got into Land Rovers and I heard about Dormobiles, I had like zero interest in them.
Yeah.
If you've ever been in a sort of a old camp trailer or something like that, it's not necessarily a pleasant experience. It's kind of, it musty, moldy.
Words you'd use to describe it. Yeah, absolutely.
Dry rot, beige.
Yeah, and that's just the
this
owners.
This is the word cloud that you might use to describe a vintage camper. But
beige, yeah, that's an abundance of beige in there.
So for a long time, I mostly just avoided Dormobiles. I thought they were just kind of like not a pleasant place to be. But,
yeah, for sure.
But then I bought one. And since then, I've really grown to enjoy and appreciate the Dormobile. And while there can be, I should say, some musty and moldy elements, they're really not that much more than a standard Land Rover. That also has.
They're just as musty and
just as musty and moldy, but they do have some really cool features that are really awesome that I really appreciate, and I've grown to appreciate over and above other sorts of camper converted vehicles. The headroom is really amazing in a Dormobile. You've got this huge corridor of headroom. It's like almost 8 feet tall when the top is up. Yeah, and it doesn't taper from one end to the other. It's consistent all the way through the whole raising roof section of the vehicle. So like a Westfalia or, many other campers, they tip from the front, an alu cab or something like that. So you've only really got standing room at one end, that sort of thing. So then it tapers to the other side. And if you're sleeping in that area or standing in that area, it's annoying to just have.
It's not great.
An inconsistent level of headroom. So the Dormobile is cool for that reason. These were, I think, originally developed in the early 60s, 61 maybe, I think was like the first Dormobile started rolling off the assembly line, maybe even before the transition from Series 2 to Series 2A. I think they kind of just got in right there at the beginning. I think I saw a very early Dormobile the other day that was actually a Series 2, but cool vehicles. And basically, for those of you that aren't familiar, the big features of these cars, there's three big features. They have a kitchenette, sort of a sink and a stove. And,
little stove. And
the stove is good. The stove is pretty cool.
It seems to me like this. Should you be using that stove inside of a vehicle? It seems like just a cold camp stove. Like, is there ventilation appropriate for that?
If you've ever been inside of a Land Rover, the amount of ventilation is not really a concern because,
you don't really worry about it. Yeah.
There's plenty of airflow.
That was one of the
whether you want it or not.
Land Rover. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you can't suffocate in a Land Rover. I'll tell you that.
Impossible. Yeah.
It's probably pretty hard. Yeah. But obviously, if you're using a stove in an enclosed space, be careful. So, but I don't think that's particularly an issue. It does have an operable window right behind it, and it's pretty well ventilated, honestly. There's also a vent in the roof, but be careful in closed space. Anyway, back to the big three deals with the Dormobile, and it's kind of the same with any camper. Honestly, you've got your kitchenette, you've got your raising roof, and then you've got your seats that fold into a bed. Those are kind of the big ones, right?
Right.
And for the Dormobile, the seats are really cool. They're very Rube Goldberg, sort of lots of levers and catches and hinges and there's a lot of pinch points. So be careful if you're not fully clothed.
It's very important.
Very important.
Good. That's a top tip right there, actually. Yeah.
Top tech tip. But the seats are cool. They fold to face one another to make a dinette, and they'll fold out to form two individual beds or together to form a larger bed. Right. And they also obviously fold forwards for driving. So setting them up takes a few minutes. Maybe it's a little more involved than in some other campers, but they sure do a lot and they sure are cool. And they're pretty comfortable in driving. They're maybe more comfortable than a standard Land Rover seat, in my opinion. But the Dormobile's great. You know, it has a lot going for it. It has curtains. It has a wardrobe. They made workshop vehicles that didn't really have a camper.
No, interesting.
They just had the raising roof, you know, for workspace. They had benches. And
I didn't
that sort
know
of
that.
thing.
I didn't know that you could get it. I thought it was just like it was only like a.
I think
like a camper
I think
thing.
99% of them were probably
Were
made as
that way,
campers.
okay.
But there is like a promotional literature that show like a little
cool.
workshop vehicles, workbench and electrical outlets and all that kind of stuff. Pretty cool. Dormobile also converted a lot of other types of vehicles, most notably Volkswagen vans, but they also did Mercedes vans, Dodge vans. In fact, there's a Dodge A100 Dormobile camper here in town, which is kind of cool. Yeah, they did a bunch of stuff. And even into the 70s, they did like Bedford vans, and they did little station wagons. And the station wagons are really funky. They have a raising roof. And then they also have like an accordion thing on the tailgate to make the load space longer.
Oh,
They're ridiculous.
that sounds ridiculous. That's cool.
Yeah, it's like it looks like some kind of weird clam opening up in all these different ways. They're very strange. But Dormobile, you know, they made them into the early 70s, I want to say, and then they stopped doing Land Rover conversions. So one of the things I really appreciate about the Dormobile is that in terms of four-wheel drive campers they actually have 4 beds. I didn't mention this, but they have bunks in the roof too.
That's right. Yeah.
So they have like if you're like a family of 4, there's actually space for.
Do you
4
have to
people.
be like a Cirque du Soleil acrobat to get up into that space?
Not exactly, but it helps. You know, you do have to kind of hoist yourself up there. I would say if you can get in a hammock, you can definitely get into a Dormobile bunk.
Okay, well that's not too bad.
It's not.
It does seem like I just remember the Westphalia being like a little tricky to like kind of have to stand on some stuff to kind of jump up in there. But
You have
I've
to
never
stand on the
actually-
sink in a Westphalia.
in a Westphalia. Yeah, I've never been. Now that I think of it, I've never been up in the loft of a Dormobile.
Well, buddy, next time you visit, I have to get you up there.
All right.
But you know, the Dormobile is really cool because it is a 4-wheel drive camper. It has four berths, as they say.
Yes.
It really is a versatile vehicle, and it has a small footprint, you know, which is cool. And it does a lot for a small footprint. So there was obviously a competitor, Dormobile.
Yes.
And that was Carawagon. And Carawagon is the Searle company. The Dormobile was produced by the Martin Walters company.
They all have to have weird English names, very Englishy.
Yeah,
That's great.
usually there's
That's
like
great.
a parent company or something. And
And
the Dormobile was sort of
yeah.
it was sort of the factory approved conversion, the first
Right,
one. And
right.
Carawagon was also factory approved, but the Carawagon conversion maybe isn't as well thought out. It's a little more basic. The
Right.
seats, you know, they do fold, but maybe they don't. They're sort of more stationary. They don't do as much.
Sure.
They're more basic. And there's a lot of wooden components in the roof of the Carawagon. And British weather and wooden components don't really go well together. But a lot of them rotted away. You know, they kind of fold out. They have like 2 aluminum sheets, and you kind of push up on it and then fold out the ends, sort of thing. And there's a lot of wooden pieces in the Carawagon, and it is cool, and it can feel comfortable, but very few of them are in really good condition. Here in the Pacific Northwest, they're pretty much all got some rot around the edges.
And that wooden roof, how would those wooden slats are they? Because I know that you sort of push it up and then you fold I guess the 2 ends of it out to kind of keep it rigid.
Yeah.
What's the underlying structure underneath that wood? Is it a cloth material? Is it
Hopes and dreams.
Yeah, right. I was going to say it's like a roll top desk.
Hopes and dreams.
How it works.
Yeah, yeah. And they frequently had a wooden roof rack that was like hanging off the front.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
They're kind of cool. I appreciate that they use those wooden components, but
For sure.
man, they sure don't hold up as well as the Dormobile stuff does, and there's less support for it. So the Carawagon is kind of an oddity. It's neat, and they did make quite a few of them, but gosh, man, I sure don't find them as useful as the Dormobile roofs.
As a Dormobile. And they had a military version of the Carawagon, right? Like
they had a military
like
contract.
Yeah.
It was like an officer's vehicle, you know, it had like a map table.
Little cottage that they could set up.
I can't tell you how many military campaigns were planned from the back of a Carawagon, but probably none of them were successful.
Probably, yeah. Those were not the ones that you heard about, because they were, kind of a big target. They look like a toll, like you'd buy a Toll House cookie out of them or something. They kind of have a,
what?
They're
full of elves.
Right? Like, don't you think they kind of have
that's
like
Keebler elves, aren't they?
Yeah, they're a little Keeblery. They're a little Keeblery, right? Like, it just feels like they're kind of made like a clock, like a grandfather clock kind of look
Maybe
to them.
Maybe a cuckoo clock. Like you would just expect somebody to pop out of the front of it.
Pop out the little middle of the front. Yeah, exactly. So, but they are super cool. And,
I like
obviously,
them.
it's an important part of Land Rover's history because those, vehicles being used as campers and things are kind of what gave way to the modern people. There's a group that we've actually chatted about getting on the show a bunch. We've not been able to do it because they're literally traveling around the world in their 130 camper conversion. A couple that goes by the name Grizzly and Bear, which is their vehicles, not them, which is important, I guess, to realize. But
you would think that's two vehicles, but
it's just one vehicle. So apparently the camper back is one vehicle, and then the vehicle itself, it's one entity. Yes, you're right. And then they mate together. But they don't, I don't think, anymore. They used to come apart because they have a 130 pickup that they have a camper shell on the back, which is also a very popular sort of conversion. This is one of those camper shells that you can get for kind of any pickup truck. It's specifically the off-roady one with kind of the little Dormobile kind of pop-up, where it has a little bit of fabric. That allows it to sort of double the headroom kind of a thing. But they're cruising around in their Defender 130.
So the first iteration that I'm familiar with of like sort of a camper like that, an in-bed camper for the Land Rover, was a factory-approved conversion called the Land Rover Explorer. And these were produced in the United States, and it was sort of a specially made camper for the bed of a 109 pickup.
Okay, yeah.
And I still have some literature for the Land Rover Explorer. It's got a really cool badge. It's got kind of a neat layout. The pictures of them. The insides are really cool. If you get a chance, Google. It's kind of hard because Land Rover Explorer. But I think Terry Ann Wakeman has a link to some literature on her website, and you can check out the Land Rover Explorer. But essentially, it's an in-bed camper, but it's integrated into the Land Rover. It replaces the tailgate. The Land Rover lights are on the back. It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. But I'm sure would make the vehicle pretty top heavy. There was one of these when I was a kid living in Indiana. There was one of these. It was a 2.25 liter diesel with an in-bed camper. So you can imagine how slow that thing probably was. Oh my gosh. Shit. But it was really neat. It was really neat.
Interesting.
And these are one of those things that they had a lot of wood incorporated into them, laminates and plywoods and these sorts of things. So I'm not sure how many of these succumb to water ingress, but I got to think that there are not any of these left. I don't think they were made in large numbers. They were produced, I think, in North America.
Oh, okay.
And they're kind of an interesting footnote in Land Rover camper history, but certainly you didn't see too many in-bed campers prior to that. That was like early 60s. And then maybe one of the most mythical Land Rover campers is the Expandicab. And the Expandicab was not really a conversion in the sense that it didn't really have much to it. In fact, it was just a kit that you could buy to convert your standard roof into a raising camper roof. And it had a little platform that you could make a bed in, but it didn't really have, a sink or a stove or fancy seats or anything. Basically, the idea was that you would get a set of hinges and props and tracks and a canvas awning and sort of a platform, and your existing roof on your Land Rover could be made to raise up, giving like a bed above the driving compartment. And these are really interesting because there's so little to it. They were inexpensive. They sold several of them, but not in large numbers. They were made in Colorado, I think Longmont, Colorado, if I remember correctly.
Interesting. Okay.
And they were sold kind of through Land Rover dealerships. And unfortunately, I briefly owned one of these, or I should say Jenna briefly owned one of these when she first got her first Land Rover. It had one of these tops on it, but she was in college at the time, and somebody offered her like half what she paid for her car for just the roof.
Just the roof.
And so she was like, oh, this will really help pay for the vehicle. And so we sold the roof. And I don't know where it is now, but it's still out there somewhere. Every once in a while, they did make 109 versions and 88 versions, but most of the ones that I've seen are 88 versions.
Yeah, I agree. I actually didn't know they made a 109 version, but and it's X Panda cab.
Correct.
If you're looking for it, there's still literature online and stuff, but they're
cool.
really cool. They are really, really neat, and there is like, kind of a modern equivalent to modernish. I mean, a Defender equivalent with the Alocabs and things like that, where you can have a roof that's basically just the roof of the car that tilts up.
Yeah.
Like that, and they're kind of neat. They're a really, if you will, a predecessor to the modern rooftop tent. I mean, they essentially, kind of serve that same sort of utility for a modern adventure camper. But yeah, the expanded cab, I would love one of those just as a thing to have. It's just kind of a neat part of sort of Land Rover history, and they're very cool. You just rip your roof apart and stick in one of these kits, and you're good to go.
Yeah, I think they're neat, and I would have one.
Also works as air brakes if you
just deploy
you
the
lose
roof
your
when
brakes,
you're-
you just deploy the roof. And you
put
get
the
a
flaps
sail.
down.
Yeah, full flaps and slow that thing down. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
If you have any information about a special or interesting Land Rover camper, there are some other more obscure ones. I think there's one called a Park Ranger, but they only make 6 examples of those.
Right.
There's some other kind of one-offs and homemades and custom ones. In fact, there's a Facebook page right now for an automotive engineer that built an 80-inch camper that was very complicated and expansive, and they did a huge trip in it. It's called Operation Roverland, and that's quite a cool one. As far as one-off ones, very elaborate. Lots of technical drawings of this thing. It's pretty cool to check out. So if you guys have any information on neat campers that we should discuss or talk about, hit us up. Send us a message.
Man, it is one of my favorite topics, and certainly one that has got plenty of fruitful ground there. So, at that, it's time to go hit the old camp trail. I'm going to go have a nap up in that Dormobile roof, and until then, we'll see you next week. Enjoy the slightly musty, moldy smell of the interior of your Land Rover, and we'll talk to you next week.
All right, thanks, Stephen.
The Underpowered Hour is produced by Liza Beres, Ike Goss, and me, Steve Beres. Pavel Svardov composed and performed our theme music. Consider supporting the show on Patreon, and if you already do, thank you. Your support makes the show possible. For even more, check out our Instagram or Facebook.